behalf of the Theosophical Society in America, I want to thank you for joining us. My name is Christopher, and I will be your moderator today. The mission of the Theosophical Society in America is to encourage open-minded inquiry into world religions, philosophy, science, and the arts, in order to understand the wisdom of the ages, respect the unity of all life, and help people explore spiritual self-transformation. We offer many programs in support of this mission, so I invite you to check our website, theosophical.org, for upcoming programs that may interest you. On to tonight's conversation. Mitch Horowitz is a historian of alternative spirituality and one of today's most literate voices of esoterica, mysticism, and the occult. Mitch illuminates outsider history, explains its relevance to contemporary life, and reveals the long-standing quest to bring empowerment and agency to the human condition. He is widely credited with returning the term New Age to respectable use and is among a few occult writers whose work touches the bases of academic scholarship, national journalism, and subculture cred. Mitch is a writer in residence at the New York Public Library, lecturer in residence at the Philosophical Research Society in Los Angeles, and the PEN award-winning author of books including Occult America, One Simple Idea, How Positive Thinking Reshaped Our Modern Life, and The Miracle Club. Mitch worked for many years in publishing, including as a vice president at Penguin Random House, where he was editor-in-chief of Tarcher Penguin, an imprint dedicated to metaphysical topics. Mitch is currently collaborating with Emmy-nominated director Ronni Thomas on a feature documentary about the occult classic, The Kybalion, shot on location in Egypt and releasing in early 2022. Richard Smoley is editor of Quest, Journal of the Theosophical Society in America. He is the author of 11 books on spirituality, philosophy, and religion. His latest book, The Truth About Magic, was released in February 2021. His previous book, A Theology of Love, Reimagining Christianity Through A Course in Miracles, was published in November 2019. His other works include Inner Christianity, A Guide to the Esoteric Tradition, Forbidden Faith, The Secret History of Gnosticism, Supernatural, Writings on an Unknown History, and The Dice Game of Shiva, How Consciousness Creates the Universe. Formerly editor of Gnosis magazine, a journal of the Western inner traditions, Richard lectures nationwide and has been featured on numerous YouTube videos. His website is innerchristianity.com. It is my pleasure to introduce Mitch Horowitz and Richard Smoley.
Thank you very much, Christopher. I appreciate that enormously. It's great to be here with all of you. I'm so delighted that so many of you have joined us tonight. We're very grateful for your time. I want to begin this evening's program by saying a word of tribute to a man who's been a great friend and influence on me, and a great influence on many others who study the occult and the esoteric in our generation, and that is Richard Smoley. I really must say to you, without any sentimentality whatsoever, that it's a dream come true in many respects to be doing this program with Richard tonight, because I can tell you, as an absolute plain fact from my own experience, that when I really began my own career as a writer and historian and presenter in occult and esoteric subject matter, going back to the early 2000s, a period of time in my life that was in some regards very arid. I was working in publishing, I was having some success, but it wasn't really precisely what I wanted to do. I had left behind writing many years earlier, and I felt a sense of lack, a sense of not understanding what kind of subject matter I really even wanted to write about. You know, I didn't want to be somebody bopping around New York City writing about politics or doing book reviews or what have you, and I didn't have a sense of mission. When I began to read Richard's books and essays, both in Gnosis magazine, one of the great landmarks of esoteric and occult media in our country's history, and other essays and books of his and other things that he had written, I realized that not only did I want to emulate the high intellectual standards that Richard brought to and continues to bring to critical study of the occult, the mystical, the esoteric, but I knew that I wanted to sound like him. There was within Richard's voice a quality of sympathetic criticism towards spiritual subject matter, criticism that could only be born from participation in the esoteric subjects that he wrote about, not just some kind of distant field study, but the kind of criticism, the kind of depth, the kind of vividness that can only come from standing at the center of some of the topics that you write about as a participant, and thus being better able to understand the values that emanate from these movements and ideas, where they succeed, where they fail, where they're wanting, where they're lacking, where they're glorious, where they're epic. And it was Richard's voice as a writer, as a thinker, as an intellectual, that helped me elude the kind of all or nothing thought patterns that tend to dominate our discourse in this country. And so it was reading Richard that I could understand topics like the life of Madame H.P. Blavatsky, the history of spiritualism, the role of Freemasonry in the founding of America, the possibility of extra-physical communication, the religiosity behind the search for supernatural intelligences, extra-physical beings, prophecy, divination, the retention of some of these ancient ideas into the modern world, and to look at these things not from a perspective of credulity or dismissal, but engagement. And so when I discovered Richard Smoley's work, and I know this is true of other writers and thinkers in our culture today, I not only discovered the subjects that I wanted to write about, but I discovered what I wanted to sound like. And so I just really must begin with that tribute to Richard Smoley, because I can tell you of the few precious bright spots that exist in our culture today, in terms of religious studies, in terms of intellectual inquiry, in terms of spiritual inquiry, we have one very, very great bright spot, and we need them. We need them, thanks to the impact and influence of Richard's work. So I've wanted to say that to him for a long time.
Well, thank you so much, Mitch. That's a great honor coming from you, and it's very, very moving to hear. I certainly appreciate your support and your help over the years, and that's been actually really quite palpable in the sense that you've published 4 of my books in your time at Tarcher Penguin, and that support has been immeasurably helpful to me in more ways than I can describe here. So it's an enormous pleasure. Of course, I regard you as a great friend and always have a wonderful time when you and I chat and get together and meet. I would like to do it more in person than we've been able to, but whenever we do, even in this form, it's always a pleasure, and I admire your insights and your depth of inquiry as well.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's dive right in. You know, I began to draw up some questions and ideas that I wanted to toss out to you, and then I, of course, realized that I mustn't neglect the basics. How do you define occultism? What is occultism to you?
Well, you could say that occultism is somewhat like oceanography. If you look out over the ocean, you have this flat surface of water where nothing, apart from the very surface, seems to be going on. Every once in a while, something pokes its head above this water, giving you a sense that maybe there's more going on than seen from the surface. The oceanographer goes down, sometimes even very deep, and sees what's going on. He sees the creatures and life that is going on all around him, even though they're invisible above the surface, and learns something about them, learns from them, interacts with them. I would say that occultism is about that in terms of the invisible worlds. We go through life living on this surface. We think everything is this surface, every now and then something pokes its head through to say, like, there's actually something more going on. I would say the occultist is the individual who wants to look into these unseen realms as an oceanographer looks into the ocean and interact with what's going on there and find out about it, learn about it, and perhaps bring something back. Are there dangers in the process? Yeah, but there's also danger going down hundreds of feet in a diving bell. So I think that metaphor is probably the best way to at least get into the subject.
Yeah. So let me ask you this, and I support that definition. You've illustrated it much more vividly than I usually do. I'll describe the occult as a belief in a hidden dimension or hidden principle of life whose impact can be felt upon and through us. And occultism shares concerns with some of the concerns that you'll find in the religions, although it has fealty to no individual doctrine or institution. Why? I mean, we live in a society, America's a heavily religious society, heavily spiritual society. Not everybody is affiliated, but most people across all walks of life would probably agree, yeah, I think there's more to life than what we experience when we're just, looking at our phone or drinking our coffee in the morning. You start to talk to people, they'll talk about clairvoyant dreams, they'll talk about extraordinary coincidences, they'll talk about prayer, they'll talk about experiences they've had, maybe in recovery movements that are religiously oriented. But we do live largely under the assumptions of materialism in our culture. And I would say materialism as a philosophy is the insistence that matter creates itself, that there's no other game in town, there's nothing else going on, so that the mind itself is just a epiphenomena of the gray matter of the brain, and the mind is like bubbles in a carbonated glass or bottle of water. The water's gone, the bubbles are gone, end of story. The truth is, we know that life is more complicated than that. Materialism just simply no longer covers all the bases of life in our time. We've had good statistical evidence for ESP-related phenomena since the 1930s as we have for anything else. We have fields, contemporary fields like neuroplasticity, that demonstrate that our sustained thoughts actually alter the neural pathways of the brain. We have deepening questions coming out from 90 years of quantum physics experiments, questions coming from time-space relativity, from string theory, even from the outer reaches of placebo studies, which have expanded so dramatically just in the past 15 years or so. Why? I mean, what's the state of materialism? Are we looking at is materialism as a philosophy going to be discredited in 30 years? Are we going to be discredited in 30 years? Why is it so difficult, for example, in our culture to accept the statistical evidence behind ESP, for example, which is so solid and has been so heavily juried, and yet in academia, in journalism, it continues to be routinely dismissed? Why?
Well, it might even be a mistake to assume that there's more intellectual freedom in academia than there was in, say, the universities of Europe in 1500s. Mm-hmm. Because there are a lot of things you just can't talk about.
Yes.
You can't, we're talking about being excluded from academic circles, people are not burned at the stake anymore.
Yes.
At least for the time being.
For the time being.
But there's an enormous amount of intellectual conformity, obliviousness, and just mass thinking going on, even among people who are supposedly so intellectually distinguished.
Yes.
Now, I would say that the materialistic world is starting to crack and fall apart. And one of the things that you allude to as part of that, parapsychological research, which really shouldn't work if on a straight materialist worldview. The recent UFO report, where the government said, basically we can't explain this. And that I have not read the report. I've read news items about it. But there's a greater and greater sense that the materialistic worldview and what one could call the scientistic worldview, the thing that the idea that everything could be explained scientifically and by science as we know it is falling and cracking to pieces. I would say, and this only occurred to me a few days ago, that one symptom of it, and I believe this is probably an early symptom of what's going on, like it or not, is the anti-vaxxer movement. People no longer are willing to trust science or take it at face value. I'm not going to take any position on that whole thing because I don't really want to waylay the conversation, but I think it is a symptom of increased skepticism of science and science's claims about complete authority.
That's interesting. I had not made that connection. And I'm interested in the UFO question, which you alluded to. UFOs are not directly related to the occult, but they are adjacent to everything that we're talking about tonight because they poke holes in the straight story of materialism. They suggest to us, look, if it's true that light speed travel amid a vast and unimaginably large cosmos is less likely, given the physical barriers involved, than some sort of interdimensional visitation. And the whole interdimensional thesis since the late 1960s has really held sway among, I think, the best intellects in the UFO field, thanks in part to the influence of Jacques Vallée. And I think over time, most people who take a serious interest in UFOs would probably say that if you have a choice between which is more likely, if you take Occam's razor to the question, interstellar travel versus interdimensionality, the latter tends to win out. So it becomes a question in opposition to strict materialism. And I guess what I want to put to you is this. I mean, are you seeing changes in our conceptions of human nature, because of the mainstreaming of UFO phenomena? I have read the DoD report. It's not very long, and it makes no mention of aliens, but the pregnancy of that absence is extraordinary because what it really says is, we don't think it's Russian technology, we don't think it's Chinese technology. It seems to be some sort of advanced technology which we are incapable of identifying. And the absence of a denial that it's extraterrestrial or interdimensional in nature is resounding, is booming. And I have noticed a paucity of pushback from materialists complaining or attacking me on social media when I reference the DoD report, and I don't often notice that kind of thing. There has been a slight pause in the materialist argument, and I want to turn that over to you and see what you make of it.
Well, I suppose I could be as cynical as I want and say maybe they're being a little bit more hesitant now because government disinformation is no longer subsidizing their so-called skepticism. I would say that's a very cynical position, but I'm not saying it's wrong. In any case, this is just one side of a very much larger aspect, which goes back to the whole quantum physics thing. And people use quantum physics to prove anything, rightly or not. But one thing it does seem to be pointing toward is that our common sense materialistic view of reality has very little to do with what's actually going on. And this is coming from science. So itself. So you can no longer have this kind of 8th grade Mr. Science view of reality whereby, Newton's laws explain everything. And this process has gone on since quantum physics was discovered, over 100 years ago, but it's slowly starting to get into the mainstream. One thing that I find really striking is that now it's becoming quite commonplace to see in mainstream, intellectual websites and things, the idea that consciousness is primary to reality. And since I wrote this book called The Dice Game of Shiva, How Consciousness Creates the Universe. I'm interested in this. So I think little by little, it's becoming part of the mainstream. And our assumptions about the reality and the way reality is are really going to start to crack, because religious institutions are cracking just as fast. And this is going to be scary.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess that leads me to another question I have, and that is, one sees all these polls coming out over, say, the past 10, 20 years that show larger and larger slices of the American public saying they're spiritual but not religious. There is a kind of radical ecumenism in American life, where in fact people might belong to recovery programs or might participate in spiritual retreats that don't necessarily have anything to do with the religion of their youth. Evangelism is a massive force in American life, and yet church membership is on the decline. The Catholic Church would be in a state of crisis if it weren't for immigrants. And one could look and say, wow, this is the age of Aquarius. Look, everybody is participating in these different religious movements at will. The spiritual search is protected. And yet at the same time, I feel like there's also this encroaching paranoia. And I feel like there's also this encroaching reactiveness. And, just last night, for example, I was on a live chat for a program that I was part of on YouTube. And somebody in the comments section was making the case that the Illuminati, a group which has not existed since Thomas Jefferson was alive, but is blamed for everything from the French Revolution to the Russian Revolution to imagery at the Super Bowl halftime show. The Illuminati was responsible for infiltrating the church and was to blame for the bodies, the mass graves that are now being uncovered in Canada, this horrible tragedy of indigenous children who were forced into these semi-reformatory schools that were supposed to make them into good Canadians or good North Americans, and apparently untold numbers of these children were abused, were denigrated, were killed, and I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg of what a monumental tragedy that is, and one that we in North America must wrestle with. But rather than addressing the obvious, which was that the church had been abusing these innocent school children, the commenter was alleging that something called the Illuminati had infiltrated the church and done this bad business. Now I realize this kind of stuff has been going on back since the witch trials, but unlike the witch trials, we have social media today. So everybody who thinks this way has a 24/7 microphone. And I am concerned about a new kind of satanic panic arising, a new witch hunt mentality arising for real. And I wondered what you think about that.
Well, Sartre spoke of mauvaise foi, bad faith. And I suppose one aspect of this mauvaise foi is trying to point toward another culprit when it's quite obvious that you're guilty. So that's certainly one part of it. The other thing is, you mentioned the Kybalion or in your introduction. And the Kybalion is a very interesting book, which we can discuss as much as you like. But one of its main principles is this action and reaction. I sometimes say that history proceeds through backlashes. And so there is definitely going to be this swing back and forth. And this is a particular time when a lot of people are well aware of their loss of control over big forces. And it's very, very tempting to find a culprit. And because it makes you feel safe, because at least you can point it on them. So whether there'll be a satanic panic or not, I don't know. I don't think that fundamentalist evangelical Christianity is strong enough, and it's not as strong as it was 30 years ago, to be able to do that as much as they would like to. But I think there is a definite sense of paranoia in the air because, the most frightening thing is, of course, climate change. And you can't blame the Illuminati for that unless you're really stupid. Obviously, some people may be. So I think this sense of paranoia, this just sense of just loss of control, is leading people to stick maps in the pins in a map to find culprits. What do you think?
I think that humanity has always been motivated by and thrilled to participate in the search for a hidden foe. It seems as old as history itself. Scripture itself, particularly the Old Testament, revolves around the search for some sort of a momentous foe, and we find meaning in who we wish to attack, shut out, lock ourselves off from, eradicate. And so if you were to wander into a 13th century village somewhere in Eastern Europe and ask what you think about Jews, witches, gypsies, etc., you'd get horrific answers. And those same kinds of answers, maybe with some different groups, still run riot today. It's just that same village somewhere is now plugged into a 24-hour digital web and has its own talk shows, radio shows, YouTube channel, etc. So it seems to me that it's the same age-old malady of human nature that now just has a 24/7 open mic and a great deal of interconnectivity in a world where we're able to travel more readily and freely. I noticed several years ago, and wrote an article about it, that violence against accused witches was occurring in different parts of the world, in Queens, New York, in London, in Latin America, in India. It wasn't just the usual places that you would suspect that were steeped in religious fundamentalism, but because we are a migratory species, this stuff was going on all over the world. But I think you've raised some good points. Evangelism as a political force is extremely powerful in our country, not as powerful as it was 30 years ago. That doesn't mean that it can't get things done. And I am watching, and I am concerned very carefully as to whether this search for a hidden foe, which for me is just the definition of conspiracism as a thought habit or a thought pattern, is going to begin to snowball, and what that's going to mean. It may just mean greater and further stratification. It may just mean that all of us just spend more and more time following the news sources and the social media accounts that we like, and then there'll be a whole other range of consequences that grow out of that. It's something I'm watching very carefully.
Yeah. I mean, I would say again that every trend has a counter trend. So it's not going to go indefinitely. It will swing the other way. Although I would not dare to say exactly how. By the way, I think I want to take issue with one thing you said, and I want to defend the Old Testament because actually you see that looking for a hidden foe much more prominently in the New Testament. Ye are of your father, the devil. We are struggling against principalities and powers, of spiritual wickedness in high places. It's actually much worse. And that most of that, what you're talking about, is much more due to Christianity than to Judaism. So, as a technical point, I think I want to just, stand up for the Old Testament in this particular case.
It's terrible.
Well,
it's terrible in both books, I think.
But I think a lot of this is Christianity, and Christianity has a lot of, as we New Agers say, heavy karma hanging down on it.
Yeah.
And it's starting to come down.
Yeah. Well, let me switch gears for a second. Apropos of the New Age, this culture of radical ecumenism, this culture of therapeutic spirituality that has run throughout our nation. I classify myself as a believing historian. That's a term that I specifically use to connote my participation in the events, in the movements that I write about. I write about metaphysics in history and practice. And so let me put this question to you. You're a person who is part of the search. You have a very deep interest in probing the nature of life and your own place and role in it. So I'd like to ask you very candidly, what is your what is your spiritual practice? What are you interested in these days? What's commanding your personal fealty at the present time?
Well, let me go back and say, what you're talking about a little bit is what academics call the difference between the emic approach, that is to say, the perspective of the people who are in it, and the etic approach, which is the approach of the people who are outside of it. The witch doctor in Africa is emic. The anthropologist studying the witch doctor in Africa is etic. At one point, I've been told that I was called an etically informed emic. And my response was, as long as you don't call me an emetic, that's fine with me. But my spiritual practice has been on a day-to-day basis. I've meditated for well over 40 years now. And I feel kind of rooted in a number of traditions, which have kind of had different effects on my life in different phases, including the Kabbalah in a non-Jewish form, Western esoteric Kabbalah, Gurdjieff's teaching, Tibetan Buddhism, A Course in Miracles. And I would say that all of those are operative. Probably in recent years, I've come back more to A Course in Miracles than I had been for several decades, for personal reasons, but also because I believe the Course is the only actually logical, consistent, and theologically clear such system Christianity's ever produced. Whether the Course was, as claimed, dictated by Mr. Jesus Christ himself, I do not know. But as I've shown I'd like to think I've shown in my book, A Theology of Love, it is actually consistent. You don't have to believe all sorts of crazy things like God got mad at the human race because somebody ate a piece of fruit in Armenia 6,000 years ago. And somehow he sent a part of himself down and had it tortured to death. And somehow that made it all right, except it didn't, because if you don't believe this, you're still going to go to hell anyway. The Course in Miracles, I think, is a very profound spiritual teaching, and it's made an enormous amount of impact. And so that is probably a thing that I personally work with, on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis most these days. How about you? Where is your spiritual practice at this point?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. I'm glad you brought up the academic terms emic and etic, at the beginning of your comments. I find those categories unsatisfying, and I would like to see them busted up in our time. And I think they're categories that were devised by materialist scholars who intended, in fact, to discredit participation as a point of inquiry. And I know people who consider themselves field workers within the academic world who set out to study how different indigenous populations or American subcultures engage in belief, and they feel that by claiming the mantle of outside observer, that in itself bestows authority, and that by someone like me being referenced, as someone who's working from within, that suggests that I'm kind of an object of their studies rather than somebody who's studying himself. And I think that with regard to belief, in fact, one of the great unspoken truths of academic life in America is that actually most historians of spirituality are, in fact, believing historians. They emerge from the congregations that they write about very frequently. This is true of our scholarly works of Mary Baker Eddy, of Joseph Smith, of many ideas and figures that emanate from Catholicism, from Judaism, and some scholars, some of which you and I have written critically of, are actually very, very deeply attached to a position of belief, which is one of disputation. They have a contempt for their subject matter, whether it's Madame H.P. Blavatsky or whether it's people who study ESP, and that belief, materialist in nature, evinces itself on every page. So I find those categories ones that I want to kind of bust up. I think they bring disclarity, and they bring a polemical quality to the study of religion. But as far as practice goes, one of the things that has commanded my dedication for a lot of years has been the New Thought movement, the positive mind movement, the belief that thoughts are causative. And that, among other practices, is a very central part of my search. And one of the things I'm really interested in right now, and that I hope I'll be bringing out during the Modern Occultism course, and that I'm writing about right now. I'm working on a new book that focuses specifically on this question. It seems to me that the thesis that thoughts are causative, that thoughts help concretize experience and make things happen, is absolutely defensible based on not only centuries, a record, we'll say, of testimony of the seeker, based not only on the standards of pragmatic philosophy, which looks for impact in conduct, in result, in experience, but also emergent from some of the fields that you and I have been talking about tonight. The outer reaches of placebo study, neuroplasticity, psychical research, quantum theory, which I realize is a kind of hornet's nest of problems, but it is popularized. It's been around for 90 years, and I think we're compelled one way or the other to grapple with it. So I believe that there is a measure of selectivity in experience, a measure of it, heavily conditioned by a lot of other things that are going on. We experience many different laws and forces, and if there is a law of mental causation, that law could be ever operative, just like gravity is ever operative, but gravity is affected by mass. The water is always water. It's always H2O according to the table of chemical elements, but it could be a solid or it could be a vapor depending on climate, depending on surrounding circumstances. So there's a lot of dynamics, a lot of different stuff going on in life, and there's a lot of shadows that fall between the dreaming and the coming true. But I'm really interested in the conditions under which we may be able to understand thoughts as being causative, and I'm really, really interested in different and simpler ways that we might be able to start to experiment with this, because the old saw, since the dawn of the New Thought movement, since the dawn of the positive mind movement, say going back to the late 19th century when it began to look and sound like what we know today, the old saw has been, you have to enter into the feeling state of the wish fulfilled. There's precedent for this in the New Testament. You'll pray as if you're expecting to receive, and so you shall. As you've pointed out, there's precedent for a lot of different kinds of prayer in the Old Testament, including making deals, transactions, expressing anger, expressing outrage, quid pro quo. One of the things that you've inspired me in understanding is that humanity has been entering into quid pro quos with whatever greater force it's praying to since time immemorial. So this is just one form of prayer, but what I'm trying to drive at is this. One of the frustrations that people have with New Thought is not only that we witness catastrophes happening to people all the time in atmospheres that are hopeful, that are nourishing, that fit every definition of positivity, but when the individual is suffering, when a person is crushed by grief, by anxiety, by addiction, by disappointment, by loneliness, that individual is not always able to, I am not always able to, enter into this feeling state of fulfillment that is supposed to be the royal road, the royal trigger to these psychical powers in your mind. So I'm asking myself, in a world that's undergoing rapid changes right now, with materialism falling apart, with a new view of human nature taking shape, hasn't quite come into focus yet, but more and more people are understanding the validity of their minds. We're seeing repeatable placebo experiments, for example, where transparent placebos are used. People are given an inert substance and they're benefiting anyway. So my question is, and the thing that I'm personally experimenting with and writing about, is it enough? Is it enough to understand yourself possessed of causative capacities as a mental being? And is the realization of that in and of itself enough to trigger the selective abilities of the mind, in the same way that it's proven to be enough in a placebo experiment to honestly and transparently receive an inert substance and still benefit from it? The belief itself, the hopeful expectancy itself, the validation itself seems sufficient. So I'm asking myself, is there an easier, more ready way that people can access these abilities? And I'm especially concerned with that because when people are suffering from depression or anxiety or grief or whatever, they can't just change their emotions. They can't change their mental state. I can't, and I can't imagine my experience is exceptional. So that's one of the big things I'm working with. Is there a simpler road to accessing some of these powers? So that's something that really occupies a big part of my effort today.
Yeah, like me, you're very familiar with the teachings of Gurdjieff. And I think one of his principal ideas is very applicable here, which is, shall we say, the multiplicity of eyes, the fact that we are not really unified human beings. And so one part of the mind may be affirming this, another part of the mind may believe nothing of the kind, yet another part of the mind may know nothing about it whatsoever. So I think the mind has tremendous power, and its power is causative, as you say. Its efficacy is going to have a great deal to do with how unified you are about it. And this is perhaps why it's so powerful in really desperate situations. Because, everybody kind of in you kind of has to get together. Look, we're in trouble here. We look, there's no screwing around here. And that focuses the will to the point where realization becomes much more possible. But I think a lot of times, and this may be part of the answer to the question I think you're looking into, in positive thinking, is it valuable? I mean, I think on a very simple level, there are a lot of people who are going around with all sorts of automatic negative thoughts running around in their heads. I'm a lousy person. I'm a real failure. I'm just a screw up. I never do anything right. And I think at minimally, positive thinking, I'm a good person. I like myself. I'm really, not such a bad guy, or God loves me, or whatever you like. I think, just at a very simple level, those can be effective countermeasures just to the automatic, habitual negative thoughts that keep running through people's head. I think it can go much further than that in ways that, you and I both discussed. But I think even at a minimal level, just replacing a negative thought with a positive one can be very healing.
Yes, I agree with that. And I think sometimes we overlook the impact of very, very simple things. And we overlook the fact that even the prospect of positive thinking, if you had said 100 years ago, 150 years ago to somebody, think positively and, you're apt to have a better outcome, they wouldn't have understood what you were saying. Today they might agree with you, they might disagree with you, but they know what you're talking about. That's a new phenomenon. That's a modern phenomenon. Let me switch gears to a different kind of question. One of the things I'll be looking at in the course is the manner in which the practice of astrology has traversed from deep antiquity, from Babylon, from other parts of the Persian world, up through the Hellenic experience, up through the modern experience. It's changed, it's morphed, the thread has gotten interrupted. There are some similarities to the astrology that we practice today versus the astrology that our ancient ancestors practiced. Western and Eastern astrology branched off for different reasons. I know that you take seriously astrology in modern practice, as do I. And I wanted to ask you why, and why does it retain a hold on intelligent people?
Well, because it's pretty accurate.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you a story about a friend of mine. I have a friend who's very brilliant but very eccentric, and I also have another friend who's a very proficient astrologer. I'm not in the mood to name names for whatever reason, but I was having drinks with the astrologer once, and I thought, well, maybe I'll bring my other friend's chart just to see what he has to say about it. So we're meeting at this brew pub in downtown Wheaton, Illinois, and I put this chart down and says, well, what do you think of this chart? And he looked at it for 5 seconds, he said, wow, that's a rough childhood. And my other friend, the friend whose chart it was, had the worst childhood of anyone I've ever known. How do you see that in a chart? Well, there has to be a little bit more than just guesswork or, what the newspapers have to say. Now, this guy is a very proficient astrologer, so there are levels of expertise. And I've just had too many experiences of that, both in my own case and in terms of general predictions. Another time, I cast a chart. This was in 2001 for the incoming young Mr. Bush administration, based on his inauguration date and time. And I looked at it and I said, wow, looks like we're going to have a war. And I thought, nah, that's ridiculous. Who are we going to have a war with? Well, events showed me. But I just had too many experiences like this, both from my own case and in others, for me to even try to argue with the doubters. If you don't agree with it, if you don't believe in it, fine. We can talk about something else.
And do you have any kind of a personal theory as to why it works?
No, none of the real theories seem to be applicable. They would seem to be suggesting that, again, our view of reality is defective enough so that we can't sort through that. Now, here's another favorite subject of mine, which I will not belabor with you too much. Our notions of causality are defective and in many ways simply incorrect. Bertrand Russell said that the doctrine of causality in Western philosophy was permitted to survive because, like the British monarchy, it was erroneously believed to do no harm. And there's a lot to that. And, this is like a university course practically. But our notions of causation are so shaky that using them to judge something like astrology is, not sufficient.
I agree with that. I mean, the idea, of course, based on cause and effect, our standard default is to say, well, if any of this works, it means that, Venus might do this, or, the tides and gravitational waves and magnetism and electricity. And this whole idea of something directing power or force at a target system is so overwhelming in the Western mind that we always think in those terms. We always think in terms of emanation target. So the planets are emanating something, you, Richard, me, Mitch are the target, whereas actually there might be something correlative going on that has nothing to do with causation whatsoever, but we're completely locked into that way of thought.
Let me just go on for a second about causation and why it's so problematic. Take the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry says, everybody says that cigarette smoking causes cancer. But there are plenty of people out there who smoke cigarettes heavily who never get cancer. Furthermore, what are you going to, I don't really see anything, what are we going to do that actually is a specific cause of cancer in all of this? I see maybe black lungs or something like that, but I don't see something you could point to that's a cause. And is that intellectually dishonest? In a way, but a more cautious person would say, well, higher, and they do say, higher rates of cigarette smoking are coincide with higher rates of lung cancer. That's not, that's we're talking about an overlap, not cause and effect. That's just a sense of how problematic this notion is and how hard it is to get past that.
So I want to ask another personal question. How has your search changed in the past 10 or 20 years? Was there an idea that was central to you that you came to feel was outmoded? Is there a new idea that revolutionized what you were doing or that reaffirmed? I'm just wondering, is your search different today than it was 20 years ago, and why?
Well, you read, and in fact, you published my book about it. As I studied a course in miracles for 40 years. And its basic principle is forgiveness. And there are metaphysical reasons for this, which, and of course, I'd always sort of bought into this. But around 8 years ago, things in life were dovetailing in not such a good way for me. And it led me to this kind of crisis. It's like, okay, I forgive everything, period. I forget everything. Just let it all go. And I accept forgiveness for myself. And this was the germ of a book that you published called The Deal, A Guide to Radical and Complete Forgiveness. And this was in June 2013. I didn't think of writing this book before I went through this process. The book was quite secondary. And although little grievances kind of pile up and, I kind of deal with them and whatnot, that really marked a radical shift in my life. And, the book chronicled it. It's not fundamentally a book about my personal stuff, which I don't find terribly interesting to write about. But I think that's probably the single greatest shift of mine in the last 20 years. How about you? Where would you say yours has been?
Well, there have been many shifts. I recommend The Deal. I was proud to publish The Deal. I worked very, very hard with The Deal. I came to a different place, frankly, in terms of my search and my personal life about forgiveness. I wrote an essay, I think it was in April of 2019, dissenting from the imperative of forgiveness. And it was funny. There's a friend of mine who's on the with us tonight, and he and I were discussing this just earlier today. When I published that essay, it was called Forgiveness, a Dissent. It's coming out in a collection of my essays that's being published next year called Uncertain Places. I found gatekeepers, editors, curators very turned off by it, very unwilling to consider it. They felt that questioning the imperative of forgiveness was akin to questioning using water to put out a fire. And yet, I heard from many readers who were very deeply touched by it and who felt a terrible weight come off them when they saw that there was someone else out there who, in this case publicly, was questioning forgiveness as a spiritual, moral, and psychological imperative. I'm not opposed to forgiveness. I just want to open up the question, which is so rarely broached within our therapeutic, spiritual, and religious cultures, of whether forgiveness is always a productive, helpful, fortifying idea. And I found that there were certain incidents in my own life where I had lessons to learn from things and responses to make to things that did not include forgiveness. And so it was a change for me, and it was a new door opened. But your book helped open that door, even though I experimented with and worked with your book very rigorously for several years. And I recommend that book to everyone, because somebody could turn around and read The Deal and say, this is exactly what I needed, not have the response that I had. But I also benefited tremendously in coming to this outlook by the rigor of work, and also the availability of the work that you wrote about in that book. So that book had a huge effect on me. It's just that I came to a different place. So that was that's been a change. That's been a change in my practice.
Well, I think you and I are both grown up enough to be able to admit that we're not going to be able to agree 100% on everything or see everything the same way. And fortunately, I think we are also grown up enough so that it will not, as Gurdjieff once said, all lead to people breaking one another's heads.
Right.
So yeah, that's legitimate. I certainly see your point of view. Hey, you're better off than I am. I put this. I put this up, and I think it's still somewhere on the internet several years ago, about forgiving Bill Cosby. And I mentioned this to my wife a few days ago. I said, well, maybe I'll put up a link to that. Said, don't do that. Don't do that. But, I have to say, there's this idea that did Bill Cosby do all of the bad things he did? No doubt. I mean, but I regard it as a legal issue. From my point of view, I don't really need to be part of the society that, is shaming Bill Cosby. It's just not of interest to me. It's not my problem. I regard it as a legal problem. If society wants to inveigh against him for the evils he's done, it's their business. But it's not mine.
Mm-hmm. Here's a different kind of question. Are there great teachers among us today? You've referenced Gurdjieff a couple of times. You and I have both been very deeply involved in the ideas that Gurdjieff brought. Lots of other figures. We've briefly mentioned Madame H.P. Blavatsky. There's, many, many figures who animate the search of people on this program tonight. Rudolf Steiner, Carl Jung, a whole range of people known and less known. Neville Goddard, who I have tattooed, somewhere. And I've had people ask me, and I've asked myself, where are the great teachers today? Where are these iconic figures? Are they with us, or do we not live in an age of great teachers?
Well, I suppose I could use that as a plug for the fall issue of Quest, which is about teachers, and which has 2 or 3 articles in it that point to my own particular insight about this matter. That the greatest and most effective teachers I've known have been ones who worked very, very obscurely with very limited circles of students, say maybe 100 max over the years. Some of them were almost absurdly averse to any sort of publicity. And they're often kind of eccentric in that they're kind of coming from rather eclectic places. Those are the teachers that I have found most effective. The great kind of iconic teachers, I don't know. I most of the ones that I can think of are either spiritual celebrities, or they're like certain Buddhist teachers who sort of like, well, they're just giving you kind of the Buddhist catechism, helpfully or not. That is my own personal impression. That's my own personal experience. So, of course, it's maddeningly frustrating, because where do you go? Well, part of the job is to actually be able to see through somebody who looks maybe kind of gruff, he may have been kind of slovenly, but hey, there's something there. If somebody's got a turban or a Zen robe, yeah, it's easy. My teacher. What do you think?
Well, I put this question years ago to a mutual acquaintance of ours, and I said, where are the great teachers today? And he said, well, we have the group. He felt that the group was a more elevated expression of the search today than the great teachers. And I wrestle with this a lot, Richard, because, for example, a fairly contemporary teacher who I love, but I never knew, is a man named Vernon Howard, who I've written about a lot. And Vernon died in 1992. He kind of reminded me of an American version of Krishnamurti, another great teacher, very unclassifiable, absolutely impossible to pin down with any label. And his insights into human nature were sublime. And he wrote about the hostility that runs through human nature, the dangerousness of this world, the imperative of being in but not of the world, and his analysis of human hostility and the brokenness of human nature, and of hostility as the primary fissure in human nature, was and remains absolutely convincing to me. I didn't ultimately feel that I was able to go with his solution to this quandary of human nature, which in a certain sense was, if I could put it in these terms, a kind of a born-again Christianity. This idea that you just have to permit the divine influx to enter you, and that will direct your life in the right ways. The issue that I had is this. I love this man. I've written about this man. I never met this man. And I've grown really, really leery of drawing conclusions nowadays about the quality of an individual unless I've spent time with that person in periods of stress and anxiety and see what he's like hardcore when he's cut off in traffic, when he doesn't get paid by somebody, when the waiter, spills soup on him or whatever. And I have never personally in my life encountered anyone whose performance in circumstances of anxiety gave me faith in the possibility of human realization. I have a friend who's a very accomplished martial arts instructor in the tradition of Aikido, and he spent a lot of time at monasteries in Japan, here in the United States. And I asked him, in all these years that you have studied, have you ever met someone that you considered to be a realized individual? And he paused and he said, no. And I find myself facing questions right now, today, as to whether, I never use the term enlightenment, which is a term I do not like and I don't find realistic as generally used today. But is there such thing as a realized man or woman? And I put that question out there in a really heavy way because I'm only too aware of how readily people would say, oh yes, you ought to meet this or you ought to meet that. And I said, well, whoa, slow down. Is that person living? Do you know him? Have you spent time with him or her in circumstances of stress? I want to be very, very plain and blunt about it. I'm not sure. I don't know whether in any practical way, the archetype of an enlightened, to use that word that I shun, or a realized individual is actual.
Well, I think my good friend John Cianciosi, who was not only director of programming at the TS, but was a Buddhist monk for over 20 years. And he knows the Buddhist scriptures extremely well. And I asked him, well, what, according to Buddhist teaching, is an enlightened being? And he said, well, in an enlightened being, the three poisons, desire, anger, and obliviousness, no longer arise. That's, I gather, a textbook definition. Well, that answers that. Have I ever met anyone like that? No. I have occasionally met people who I could tell from some kind of weird way were on a higher level than I was, but that's about all I would really be willing to say. And, if that is the Buddhist definition, well, I certainly, I haven't met anyone who's close to that.
And let's say a word about Madam H.P. Blavatsky, who, hangs over tonight's proceedings, who's responsible for us being here, who's responsible for so many things that have flowered and opened up in spiritual life, Western world, Eastern world. She's a figure of tremendous controversy, even to this day. I remember several years ago I published a very, very good biography by Gary Lackman of Madame Blavatsky. And without our ever having solicited their opinion or their attention, the book was the subject of very sort of bilious reviews in the Paris Review and Harper's Magazine, and I didn't remember either of them ever requesting a copy. And I would joke with Gary that, can you fathom that a figure who passed away some, about 150 years ago still evokes such passion, such anger within the environs of opinion-shaping intellectual culture. And one of the things you've pointed out, and I think this captures something very important in your thought style, and that's partly why I'm bringing this up, you've made the point that you see absolutely no reason whatsoever to take an all or nothing, take it or leave it, point of view of Madame Blavatsky or anybody else. And I think that has really characterized the nature of your search. And I suppose I'm asking a question about Madame H.P. Blavatsky, a figure who I hold in deep veneration and who I also understand and realize and acknowledge people's frustrations with. But at the same time, I'm also asking a question about intellectual style, and this kind of brings us full circle to where we were at the beginning of our discussion, which we'll soon wrap up and go to the questions of the participants. What is it in human nature that makes us gravitate towards these all or nothing, take it or leave it positions, that makes it so difficult for us to evaluate subjects in the light of uncertainty?
Well, as I think the Russian philosopher Uspensky called that part of the mind the formatory apparatus. And he said the formatory apparatus can only count up to two. You know, it's Democrats, Republicans, fascists, communists, bourgeois, proletarians, and whether that is validated in conventional academic psychology. I think we have to admit that tendency in the human mind is there. It's real enough. And then you get into this thing like, how far does this delusory aspect of the human mind go? Because, hey, wait a minute, all of the ancient traditions that are saying, you know, we don't really see reality as it is. There's either a screen, a mental screen, and what we're actually perceiving is not there. It's not there in the way that we think it's there. And that's, of course, the most frightening thought of all. But I think it's yet another thing that points to that sense of like, well, maybe our perception of reality is a lot more off base than we like to believe. What do you think?
Well, I think Uspensky was right about the existence of this formatory apparatus that can only count to two. I must admit, and this may sound naive of me, and this may be where, you know, I don't know, my perspective as a frustrated idealist comes out. I really am surprised sometimes that people like us who live in the Western world, who live, it so happens, in North America, where for many of us, most of the time, questions of physical survival are fairly well settled. Death is not the palpable presence that it was for our ancient ancestors or even for generations that slightly preceded us. We have comforts that people couldn't have conceived of even a few generations ago. We have the ability to partake of all different ideas. It's really notable to me that this binary thinking, this all or nothing thinking, this formatory, I can only count to two thinking, seems to continue absolutely unabated. And I'm really surprised by it, quite frankly. And I'm surprised that there are people in the professions and in academia and in the sciences, less so in the sciences than in certain reaches of the humanities and the social sciences, who seem just incapable of even arriving at a number that's a division between 1 and 2, 1.5, 1.8. I'll settle for 1.9, I mean, it would seem to suggest that if we can count up to 2, at least we could count in fractions, but we seem unable to count in fractions. And my hope is, that with this upcoming course, we're able to look at occult and esoteric and mystical subject matter and not come away with hardened definitions about when did this begin and what line of demarcation separates us from the ancients or separates the ancients from the Renaissance mind or separates East from West or separates Eastern astrology from Western astrology or where cause ends and effect begins or for that matter within ourselves where ego begins and essence begins and begin to sort of dissolve some of these categories because I think they get in the way of helping us to understand reality. So my hope is that's one of the things that will emerge from the course.
Thank you so much. That's such a fantastic conversation. I just wish I could keep it going. So we'll hop in with some really good questions. We have some locations. The first one is from Chicago. What trends do you both see in the youth of today in regards to the religious or occult studies?
Richard, you're an expert on youth culture. I'll turn that over to you.
Just like every other 64-year-old man. Yeah, right. Well, I think there's an enormous creativity and openness. And in fact, a question I might even ask you, Mitch, is all of this incredible diversity in, what is it called? Cosplay? How is it pronounced? Cosplay? I really think that we may be undergoing a real occult revival, both in youth culture and elsewhere. Would you agree with that?
I definitely agree with that. And I always used to reject that because every Halloween, when mainstream journalists get interested in what I think about anything, they want to talk to me about an occult revival. And I would always say to them, I don't see an occult revival. Interest in the occult is an evergreen. And I think we're too ready to talk about these, kinds of revivals just to look for a news hook, for whatever feature story somebody wants to do. But in fact, I do agree with you. I think that the therapeutic uses of psychedelics, the mainstreaming of the UFO thesis, a revival that I think and hope is coming in ESP research, and a genuine openness to ideas that help us understand some of the joys and torments that trail us through life, that go beyond the cognitive. I think probably does spell an occult revival. Yes.
What do you have to say about the divine feminine and the power of the deep care from the heart in relation to this discussion, which is mostly centered on the divine masculine and the powers of the mind?
Mm-hmm.
I'll let you start that one, Mitch.
Okay.
Or I will.
No, I'm happy to, whatever
Go
you
ahead.
prefer. Yeah, I mean, I do recognize, the point that's being made there. I want to say that, we have spoken a lot over the course of this exchange about intellectual styles, thought schools, methods of criticism. I do believe that emotion, the heart, it's the driving factor behind everything. If one refers to that as the divine feminism, I'm entirely at ease with that. Everything that we're describing in a certain sense is really just that, a descriptor for things that I think we're motivated by emotionally. Ethics come from the emotions. The search comes from the emotions. Questions of forgiveness, whether embracing it or dissenting from it, come from the emotions. So if one defines that as the domain of the divine feminine, I would say it's the antecedent of everything we've been talking about.
Next one, what are your thoughts on psychedelics or entheogens, and perhaps their roots being influential in early Christianity and the mystical traditions in the West? And this comes from Chicago.
Give that to you, Richard.
There is some evidence, even archaeological evidence, that certain psychedelic substances may have been used in early Christian sacraments. I'm not the expert on this subject. In terms of psychedelics, I think I wouldn't, well, I'll tell you, I worked a lot with psychedelics from 1987 to 1991. But it was at the suggestion of guidance of a psychiatrist who I later learned was an expert in the use of psychedelics in therapy. And I got a lot out of it. It was time to, and I got a lot out of it psychologically and spiritually. There was a time when it was obviously time for me to finish. So I could not say that it's all bogus. I think you have to be really careful with it, and you would probably be better off under some thoughtful professional supervision. But I think they can, under those circumstances, be very useful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd only be echoing that.
Could you both speak on meditation and its influence into the journey of deeper states of consciousness and perhaps accessing even interdimensionality?
Yeah, I'd like to say something about that. I practice Transcendental Meditation, which is a mantra-based form of meditation. I practice in the morning, I practice in the evening. It's funny, about maybe a year ago, 18 months ago, I was on a popular podcast hosted by Duncan Trussell. And I mentioned, and I spoke very freely and candidly, that at that time I was not meditating. And I had my reasons for that. And I remember that many people commented and wrote to me in great umbrage, as if to say, you're not meditating, how dare you? And the tones were, it's kind of funny that the tones were similar to those that are evoked when I sometimes raise questions, as I do very deeply, about the validity of concepts like non-attachment or non-identification. And then people want to argue with me that I'm wrong to dismiss questions of non-identification or non-attachment as goals on the spiritual path. And, it always seems like a kind of roundabout way of evincing the concern that I'm speaking about when we get overly attached to or caught up in those concepts as an end game. So I've gone through periods of life where I've meditated and where I haven't. I'm going through a period of life where I am meditating now. My experience, personally speaking, with transcendental meditation is that it's been an enormously helpful practice physically. The relaxation that it brings, a term that I use in the deepest sense of the word, is absolutely profound and necessary. I am very interested, and I'll speak about this some during the course, in using our minds in states that go outside of everyday cognizance or consciousness. For that reason, I'm really interested in the state of hypnagogia, which some of you have heard me talk about before, that exquisitely relaxed state that you naturally enter twice a day, just when you're falling asleep at night, just when you're coming to in the morning. And academic ESP research has demonstrated in I think, a really authoritative way that is prime time, so to speak, for ESP-related activity or anonymous transfer of information. It's prime time for reprogramming your psyche. It's prime time for self-suggestion. I can't say it has opened any interdimensional doors to me, although what is an interdimensional door? If linear time itself is illusory, which I think has been pretty well demonstrated by time relativity, by the very fact that time in its impact and experience slows down when you're traveling at or near light speed, and other mechanical models have demonstrated that too. If linear time itself is a necessary illusion to help us navigate through day-to-day life, then just stepping outside of linear time, I think, could be said to be an interdimensional experience. I've had that with hypnagogia, so I hope that speaks to your question.
Well, yeah, I certainly agree with that. The only thing I would add is, the author Somerset Maugham once said that when he was a young man, he resolved on an ambition that if he ever was very successful, that every day at lunch and dinner, after lunch and dinner, he would smoke a good cigar. And later on in life, he said, in the end, I found that was the only ambition I was completely able to fulfill, and also the only one that did not cause some measure of dissatisfaction. And I pretty much feel that way about meditation. I've done it for a long time. What does it do? I don't know. I mean, I can't point to any direct benefits in my life because I've done it so long, but it's certainly a very deep and powerful part of my life, and I would be very much poorer without it.
Could you both speak about the tarot and specifically the amount of attention it seemed to gain in pop culture recently?
Yeah. Tarot is an interesting topic, and Richard and I have both written about this and talked about this from time to time. It's a difficult topic to talk about because people within the alternative spiritual culture tend to be very cemented in a point of view of tarot that it's this ancient book of wisdom that has primeval roots. And then when you point out that, its earliest roots are traceable to the early Renaissance, late medieval period where it was a game, and it was only later on that it took on mystical dimensions, although I honor its mystical allegory, people get very upset. And I'm on some video on YouTube that was produced by Gaia where I record this historicity, and of course I'm accused of being an agent of the Illuminati or other nefarious forces that are trying to rob people of the history of tarot. And the truth is, what one has to understand is that when we use the term game today, it sounds kind of frivolous, like a pastime or an entertainment. when you use the term game in terms of the medieval period or in terms of the early Renaissance, you're using it not unlike the way the word play is used. It's something that is laden with meaning. People had so few possessions, even royalty, in the medieval period, that there was no just little household object that was easily dispensable. A game could be a matter of very, very deep serious, imbued with imagery and allegory and symbolism. And that's what tarot was. And if you look at the images on tarot, I mean, they are really an extraordinary mystical allegory because they speak to people all over the world. You know, I mean, I think you could get people from any part of life, pre-modern folk, you know, from Polynesia to Siberia, who would recognize the figure of death, the emperor, the lovers, the magician, the Pope or the Hierophant, the devil, you know, the high priestess, whatever. You know, I think all these images speak to the human psyche going back to time immemorial. I have an article, I believe it's up at Medium, and it's called, I forget the title, so you have to forgive me, but it's called something to the effect of, Is Tarot for Real? Is Tarot for Real? And I do use tarot cards. I do perform private readings for myself and for people who I love. It is something that I happen to experiment with, and I do think that pictogrammatic oracles, whether tarot or the I Ching, do have something to offer, and they may be, I'm speaking in real shorthand, so you'll have to forgive me, but they may be a kind of frozen snapshot in time that give us a sense of everything that's going on, as I was referencing linear time really being illusory. You know, it's possible that a pictogrammatic snapshot in time could reveal stuff that's going on all around us. That's my point of view, and you can take a look at the article, see whether you agree.
Yeah, well, just last week I finished writing a course for on the tarot for the Theosophical Society, and you can get it. Of course, you would have to be a member of the Theosophical Society, which I hope might be an incentive. But the whole gist of this was, and the title of it was Tarot, a Dictionary of Archetypes. And the thesis is very simple, that the major arcana, the 22 cards, trump cards of the tarot, are a kind of index or reflection of the major Jungian archetypes. If you go through a list of Jungian archetypes, you know, the wise old man, the fool, the trickster, the great mother, you can relate them to those cards really actually pretty easily. I'm not saying that's the only thing about it, but I think that is one source of their powers. They're archetypes. And like any archetype, an archetype is not an image per se. It's a constellation of energy that can produce any number of images. So that's why you have so many wacky different versions of the tarot, because they're all somebody's view of this archetype. And from that point of view, they're legitimate, although some are artistically much, much better than others.
Thank you. How do you both approach prayer, and do you direct it to anyone?
I take a very radical approach to prayer, and I believe very strongly, personally speaking, in the efficacy of prayer, provided it's completely unmoored from anything that you're told that you're supposed to do. I take very seriously that our ancient ancestors, and again, this is true in every culture across the world, separated by vast distances of time, geography, language, culture, habit, people from every culture across the world, in literally all of our sources of recorded history, and I mean going back to the Negev Desert 50,000 years ago, where there exists a primeval altar for worship of the moon. People from all over the world from time immemorial in human history have identified and very frequently personified energies from within nature and sought petitionary relationships with these personified or deific energies. And I offer people every encouragement in probing those possibilities, and in doing so according to their own proclivities. Richard was speaking about the Jungian archetypes and how these are reflected on the deck. They're also reflected among the gods. So you may, as a student of mythology, as a student of spirituality, identify archetypally or otherwise with an ancient deific figure who might go by names like Minerva or Set or Jupiter or Anansi or any number of different names from any number of different epochs of human history. And there's absolutely nothing to stop you from privately experimenting with seeking a petitionary relationship with that personified energy. It's something I encourage very, very deeply as a piece of experimental religiosity. It's part of my search.
Yeah, I pray all the time. I mean, I pray silently and at times, so nobody really knows if I'm praying or can see, which is the way I like it. Yes, I pray to God. How do I see it theologically? Well, God, the absolute, the eternal, is beyond all human conception. And as often said, on the other hand, we are human, and we as humans have conceptions of God. So, which I think is legitimate in a way, much as Mitch was saying, as long as you don't realize they're absolute, as long as you don't mistake the image for the reality, which used to be called idolatry. But in terms of my personal approach, well, I would say, as Thornton Wilder said, we all know that there's something that's eternal, and that something has to do with human beings. And it does have something to do with human beings. And then here we are with all my little problems and whatnot, and it feels emotionally and even practically helpful to seek out some kind of relation with it. The Orthodox Christians have this prayer of the heart, but the prayer of the heart they use is not the original version. The original version, the oldest one known, is a version of first verse of the 70th Psalm, and it basically says, "Oh God, make speed to save me. Oh Lord, make haste to help me." That is to say, there is this absolute, there's you, help. That is very, very theologically simple. You don't have to say, "Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner." I don't necessarily believe all of that, which is the standard form of the prayer. But here, God, help. The Hasidim say that you should, when you have a problem, you should go and moan and cry to God like a child complaining to his father. So that is my personal view and attitude and approach toward it.
I see we're nearing the end of our time. Christopher, should we take one more question and try to close on that note?
Sure. There's many questions. We'll try to finish up with a good one. Like a lot of people, I love finding out what my favorite thinkers consider to be their favorite books, movies, and albums, or just your favorite authors, filmmakers, and musical artists. Could you please share some of those?
Sure. Wow. A friend of mine, Michael Muhammad Knight, asked the question of whether a movie can be a sacred experience, can be a transcendental experience. He began his conversion to Islam at the age of 15, watching the movie Malcolm X. I do believe movies or other media can foster transcendental experiences. For me, the Russian science fiction movie Stalker has been one of the seminal pieces of media in my life. I turn to it again and again. It's bizarre. I mean, it was a Soviet-era science fiction movie made in 1979 based on another Soviet-era science fiction novel called Roadside Picnic, in a society that was officially atheistic and materialistic, burdened by tremendous censorship. And yet, this piece of art, produced under repressive conditions, does a better job than anything I have ever encountered in capturing the imperative of American metaphysics, which is the idea that thoughts are causative, something that Richard and I were talking about earlier. And it's one of the grand ironies of modern life that it's a piece of art produced in the Soviet era in an atmosphere of censorship and official materialism that did a better job framing the possibilities of, and the quandaries of, new thought than I think anything our country has ever produced. So I'll leave it at that one example. Turn it over to Richard.
Well, my favorite book ever was also produced in the Soviet era. It's Dr. Zhivago. It's also my favorite movie, and although the movie makes departures, it's faithful to the spirit of the novel. And I've certainly read the novel any number of times over and over again. It just strikes me as a profound, well, it just speaks to emotion. I mean, a powerful contrast between the deaths and horrors of the Russian Revolution and the constant need to assert life and to promote life. In fact, it says, all great genuine art is a continuation of the revelation of St. John, because it meditates on death and therefore creates life. And certainly that's true of that book. So I think I will leave that too with that one example. I could come, of course, with many others, as I'm sure you could, Mitch.
Yeah, right on.